Elizabeth, the Legacy, where we'll be walking in the footsteps of history, not only in the footsteps of Queen Elizabeth I, but in the footsteps of her parents. And that will take us to the Tower of London, where we can walk in the footsteps of these three very famous historical characters, all famous for their own reasons. But we take you to the Tower of London in the beginning part of the video, where at first we walk in the footsteps of Elizabeth's parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, when Elizabeth was still in Anne's belly, or newly in Anne's belly, and that's where her story began. We'll also look upon the face, the real face of that most terrifying of fathers, Henry VIII, and then we'll walk in the footsteps of Elizabeth at the Tower, her experiences there, which were not pleasant, and we'll visit the reason why the Tower fell into such disrepair in Elizabeth's reign. After her coronation, the Tower of London is not a place that she went back to. Then once we've finished walking in the footsteps of Elizabeth, we'll be looking at surviving items that belonged to Queen Elizabeth. There's a few of them still about, you'd be surprised. So we'll have a look at that. Then we'll examine the legacy of good Queen Bess. She was long remembered after her death. Her accession day was a national holiday, public holiday for 300 years. So that's from the 1550s right up to the 1850s. So a very popular and much loved monarch. So, join me at the Tower of London. Hi everyone, and I wanted to start our Elizabeth, the Legacy off with the beginning really of her story while she was newly in her mother's belly. So this is the Byward postern gate, and Henry VIII greeted Anne Boleyn when she walked through this narrow gate before her coronation in 1533. This private entrance was for important visitors and precious goods only. When Anne came through this gate, Henry VIII went down on one knee and swore that he would love her forever. By this time, Anne was already pregnant, having got pregnant before they got married. So that was that one. They had acquired what they said was a private ceremony, and then a more public ceremony. The private ceremony may have not happened. It may have just been to cover the fact that she was pregnant when she was crowned, and already pregnant when she was getting married, which wouldn't have been a good thing. After Catherine of Aragon was so loved, and Anne was already called a whore, so that wouldn't have been good. And yeah, this is where I want to begin our story off of Elizabeth the Legacy, the Tower of London. So at this point she's still in her mother's belly, and their parents are still very much in love. Father, Henry VIII, swore that he would love Anne Boleyn forever. That unfortunately did not last. So there we are. Join me for the next part of the video. And there we are. This is the face of that terrifying father, King Henry VIII. This is his death mask. As I've said before in some of the other videos, and the Westminster Abbey one, if you've watched the upper galleries, when a monarch died, an effigy would be made to be placed on their coffin, and the face was normal. They tried to get the face as accurate to the monarch as they could, so they used death masks. And this is the face of King Henry VIII. The man that Elizabeth revered as her father, but a man that instilled a lot of fear and terror into people. Look at the face of some called a tyrant, and Elizabeth called her beloved father. So there we are. It's Henry VIII. Elizabeth's first real encounter with the tower was a very frightening one indeed, and that was coming through Traitor's Gate as a prisoner of her sister Queen Mary I. Not many people that came in this way got back out again alive, but when Elizabeth came to the tower as a prisoner, brought by barge, and she'd put that off by pretending to be ill and all sorts until it couldn't be put off no longer. When the boat alighted at the stairs, Elizabeth sat down on the stairs and refused to move, and she said better to stay here than to be taken to a worse place. So that's where we catch up with Queen Elizabeth I coming through Traitor's Gate. She had a few brushes with the tower. This was probably her worst one, I should think. There we are. And on to our next little bit of the story. It isn't often in all of my documentaries or that you can walk in the footsteps of the character we're currently examining. But in the case of Elizabeth I, we are able to do that. We next pick up on Elizabeth's time at the tower as a prisoner. As the prisoner of her sister Queen Mary. And she was imprisoned in the bell tower, which is behind the governor's house there. Obviously a very frightening time for Elizabeth I, considering that her view looked out onto the scaffold where her mother had been executed, and it was said that she was imprisoned in this area, so she got that view. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's also said that some say that this is where Elizabeth and Robert Dudley first met, because the Dudleys were imprisoned in the Beauchamp Tower there. There's Dudley engravings and graffiti inside there, but whether they met here or not is conjecture. Some people believe it was later on, but we don't know. We're never going to know that, because Elizabeth, she became quite ill when she was a prisoner at the tower here and eventually she was allowed to walk the green or the grounds, and Dudley eventually was allowed to walk as well, so they may have met there, we just don't know. But the governor's house, which is through there, or the Queen's house, which I don't know if we're going to be able to see it. Yeah, it's now been renamed to the King's house. That played a bigger role in the gunpowder plot of 1605, which was just 2 years after the reign of Elizabeth I. But yeah, so as I say, this is where we next pick up on Elizabeth I, and here she goes in her costume, Queen Elizabeth I. So we'll watch her wander off. I like that when the reenactors come out. It helps with my storyline. But yeah, this is where we next pick up in the walking in the footsteps of Elizabeth I, is when she's a prisoner here. We will catch her again at the Tower of London. One last time. She didn't stay very much after that, or visit the tower very much after that, for obvious reasons of what happened with her mother. And under Elizabeth's reign, the tower fell into a great state of disrepair. Yeah, this is the view, and we're walking in the footsteps of Queen Elizabeth I while she was imprisoned here. So God knows what must have been going through her mind then. The fact that she survived it and then became Queen, well, that'll be another thing we visit in the video. Join me for the next part. And this is that bell tower in which Elizabeth I is said to have been imprisoned. So, not a nice place for her, and with a bird's eye view of the green where her mother was executed. So yeah, it was well thought out, that one, wasn't it? So that's our traces of Elizabeth at the tower. Towards noon, on a very frosty cold 17th of November 1558, under this tree is where Elizabeth was sitting at Hatfield House, and she was sitting under this tree reading a book when the privy councillors rode to her and told her that she would be queen. After getting over the shock of that, her reply to that was,
"This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes."
And in that moment, she went from suspected traitor, living under the constant threat of her sister Mary, wondering what was going to happen, what wasn't going to happen. She went from that to being Queen of England. And so she has one last little jaunt with the Tower of London. As all monarchs did in Elizabeth's time and beforehand, they would spend some time before their coronation at the Tower. So God only knows how that must have made the poor woman feel. But this is a photograph taken by myself on Wednesday. And when Elizabeth left the Tower for her coronation, which took place on the 15th of January 1559 at Westminster Abbey, as she left the Tower and came out to the cheers and acclamations of her people, she looked back at the Tower, and what was going through her mind became all too apparent, because she raised up her hands to heaven and looked at the people and said, "Some have fallen from being princes of this land to being prisoners in this place. I am come from being a prisoner in this place to be a prince of this land. The former I know to be an act of God's justice. This I know to be an act of his great mercy." So, yeah. And she left the Tower. That was her last little view of the Tower, and she went from there to her coronation. After that, she doesn't appear to have stayed at the Tower again or visited it much at all, really. And under her reign, certain parts of the Tower fell into great disrepair, which is understandable. If you had some really dark memories of a place, you probably wouldn't want to go back and revisit it, would you? But yeah, that's Elizabeth's last little ventures of the Tower, and us being able to walk in her footsteps, so to speak. And now on to the next part of the video. Now, I've chosen these 6 particular items that are known to belong to Elizabeth I, or been used, worn or played by Elizabeth I. There are more items out there. I've not shown them either because they can't definitely be proven to have belonged to her, or because there's copyrights on the images. So these are the 6 I've chosen that are proven to have belonged to her, don't have copyrights on the images, and represent the objects that I wanted to show you, starting with from the earliest and what I found one of the more interesting ones. This is one surviving glove, the other is lost, of course, and this glove was worn by Elizabeth on the way to and leaving her coronation. When crowned and whatnot, she would have removed her gloves, of course. This is a kid glove embroidered with silver and gold. It looks dark and brown now, but it would have been very bright in its day. And on that day, in January 1559, when Elizabeth was crowned in the coronation chair, wearing the Tudor crown imperial, which no longer exists, and holding the old Alban sceptre, which no longer exists, thank you to Oliver Cromwell for that, but with those gloves and the great state robes, she must have glistened and shone, mustn't she? And one of her sayings was, "Majesty makes the people bow." So she knew that she needed to be queenly and to put a good show on because the people liked it. So that's our first object. Our next one, gloves again. Elizabeth is recorded, painted, and many people, even her enemies, commented upon her long and slender fingers. And that's borne out with her gloves as well. More gloves again. She was presented many gloves as gifts. These gloves were given to Elizabeth on her visit to Oxford University in 1566, part of her one of her great summer progresses, the visit to Oxford, is one of her happier memories. She loved it, and Elizabeth was a great scholar herself. She loved learning even into her old age. She was translating Latin documents and stuff when she was in her 60s, and she encouraged learning in other people. So her visit to Oxford University was one of her great memories, and these must have acted as a nice remembrance, as a token of that visit. Our next object, and this one is one of the most interesting ones. This is known as the Chequers Ring, which is kept at the UK Prime Minister's country residence, Chequers. The main body of the ring is made from mother of pearl. Its outer casing is gold, rubies, sapphires and pearls. It's a secret or locket ring, and we can't see the other bit of it because in this photo it is opened. It has a great sapphire on it. And this ring was worn by Elizabeth all her life, for a long time. The pictures or miniatures on the inside, the larger and slightly more ornate miniature on the opening part of the ring is the Queen herself. The slightly smaller miniature portrait on the main body of the ring itself is a miniature of Anne Boleyn, the Queen's mother. Now, as I said in the documentary, it's not much known how Elizabeth felt about her own mother because it's not recorded that she spoke about her that much. She probably would have done so in private and that, but Elizabeth wore this ring all her life, which gives us a gist to how she felt about her mother, because if there were bad feelings, you would not have worn such a token, and certainly not have worn it all your life. Another interesting fact to this ring is, according to legend with the ring, you'll remember in my documentary when Elizabeth was dying and Cecil, the minister, had Robert Carey, the Queen's cousin, and horses placed all along the North Road to ride post-haste to King James with the news that Queen Elizabeth was dead and he was king. Well, the ring that was taken off of the Queen's finger and dropped into the waiting hand of Carey and sped post-haste to Scotland is said to be this ring. And upon receiving it, King James would have known that he was king, the Queen was dead, and that he was not only King of Scotland but England and its other dominions. Our next object, the virginals. The early harpsichord, as I described it, they are an early harpsichord of sorts, and Queen Elizabeth is recorded to have been a very good musician. It wasn't just flattery, she was, even her enemies, some of them recorded her as being very good. She could play the lute and the virginals, and this set of virginals belonged to Elizabeth I, and that can be borne out by the fact that it has the royal arms painted on the side. Our next object, and I find this one the most interesting, this is the Essex ring. It's a cameo of the Queen, a carved cameo set in gold. This ring was definitely given by Elizabeth to Essex, her last male great favourite, that one that went to the block in the end. The legend that goes with this ring, and it has been pretty much disproven to be bollocks, is that she gave this ring to Essex and said to him it was a token of her love and great favour, and that if he should ever need her or was in danger, that he was to send the ring to her and she would send aid no matter what the cause. Now, fast forward some years and Essex is going to the block. The legend is that he gave this ring to a boy for it to be sent to the Queen in the hopes that she may spare him or aid him. Anyway, the boy gave the ring to one of the Queen's ladies. In the last part of our documentary, that lady, the last female friend of Elizabeth, whom Elizabeth was present at this lady's deathbed, the boy gave the ring to this lady apparently, and instead of taking it to the Queen, the lady gave it to her husband, who, being no friend of Essex, kept the ring rather than sending it to the Queen. Anyway, fast forward some more years until that lady was dying and the Queen was present at the deathbed, and this lady is supposed to have then given Elizabeth the ring and told her what had been done, and Elizabeth is supposed to have said, "May God forgive you, madam, for I never can." This has been disproven to be utter nonsense by the fact that yes, Elizabeth was present at that lady's deathbed, but her reaction to that lady's death was so extreme and intense that it threw Elizabeth into the severe depression, which in the end would lead to her own death. Now, if you crossed Elizabeth, and doing something like that to Elizabeth would have been crossing her really badly, she would never have forgiven it, and she certainly wouldn't have taken on so at a person's death. So that's been disproven to be bollocks, basically. But an interesting story nonetheless. This is a picture I took myself in the upper galleries, and this is Queen Elizabeth I's corset. This effigy or mannequin is all that remains of the original funeral effigy of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, in those days, when a monarch died, they had extremely long lying in states, mostly because they couldn't be buried until the next monarch came along and instructed it. And indeed, Elizabeth was buried a month after her death. That wasn't unusual. But upon death, they would be, as in Elizabeth's case, washed and dressed by her ladies, embalmed, wrapped in waxed cerecloths, sealed into a lead coffin, or clapped in lead as they called it, and then put into a wooden coffin. Now, we're used to a lying in state which doesn't last that long, and when we go to a lying in state, the symbols of royalty that we see upon a coffin are the crown and the sceptres and things like that. But in their day, what people wanted to see was their monarch. So you would have an effigy of your monarch with as lifelike a head, normally made from a death mask, wearing the imperial robes and the crown and everything, the sceptre, and it would be laid on top of the coffin. Now, this is all that remains of Elizabeth's original effigy. Come the 1700s, these effigies, and there are quite a few of them, were in a right state, and they were known as the Ragged Regiment, and people were taking the wee-wee out of it. So Westminster Abbey vamped up what they had, repaired, and they did use some of the original things, but the effigy of Elizabeth that we see with all the clothes and everything on is from the 1700s. But this is her original one, and all that remains of it. But the corset was Elizabeth's and would have had to have been acquired to fit the effigy and to fit the Queen's clothing to go on the effigy. So we know that this corset would have been worn by Elizabeth towards the end of her life. And it's well recorded back then, even by some of her enemies, that she did have a very trimline waist, mostly through discipline of her diet, because it's recorded that she said to someone once that she never did delight in belly cheer, which means that, unlike her father, she wasn't greedy. And probably with a father the size of Henry VIII, you can see why she didn't want to be greedy. So with a control of her diet and the corset, this is why she kept a good trimline waist. But yeah, that's the corset of Queen Elizabeth I. And those were the objects that we know to have belonged to Queen Elizabeth I. Hope you all found those interesting. And now on to the last part of our documentary, which is Legacy. How was the Queen remembered? And she was well remembered long after her death. So on to that. I thought we'd start Elizabeth the Legacy part off with looking at 5 of the most famous portraits of the Queen. This is the rainbow portrait, so called because the Queen grasps in her hand a rainbow. The colours are somewhat faded now, but back in its day it would have been a bright rainbow. Packed with symbolism, the grasping the rainbow is a double symbolism. One is the symbol of peace, and 2, it shows the might of the Queen's majesty by being able to grasp and control the elements. She also wears in this dress the famous eyes and ears portrait, symbolic in itself to tell everyone that saw this portrait that the Queen's eyes and ears were everywhere, so watch your mouths and behave yourselves. Next, the Darnley portrait. The Queen wears an almost masculine doublet in this portrait to symbolise and show that she is the equal of any man and any prince of Europe. And you can see just by her arm there the Tudor Crown Imperial. the great and famous Armada portrait. Our ships shown in the nice weather on the left side, and the Spanish shown in the Protestant wind being blown to hell and back on the right. Elizabeth rests with her hand on the globe, the Tudor Crown Imperial by her side, and wearing what we can only describe as a somewhat flamboyant dress. The Ditchley portrait, so called because it was painted for Sir Henry Lee, Elizabeth's champion, and he lived at Ditchley Park, where Elizabeth's feet rest on the map. A posthumous allegorical picture painted in 1610, so some years after the Queen died. She would never have allowed anything like this in her lifetime, and it shows the Queen with Father Time and death, and it is by Barthol II, and the Tudor Crown Imperial is being borne above the Queen's head, and this is the nearest to what we may know what she looked like when she was old. Whether this man saw the Queen and painted from memory or not, God knows. But yeah, this is the posthumous portrait. Queen Elizabeth's Accession Day, or Queen's Day as it was known, 17th of November, was celebrated for 300 years after her death, well into the 1850s. With fireworks and pageants and displays and fairs and all sorts. The people long remembered Queen Elizabeth. There were many books, pamphlets and reprints of works from her time published as well, and I'm privileged enough to own one of those, so that's what we'll end off the video with. So to that part now. And this is that little piece of history. This is a book that was published in 1726, 123 years after the death of Queen Elizabeth. And this was published for the 1726 Queen's Day celebrations, or as part of them, because the Queen's Day celebrations, as I said, was a national holiday for 300 years after the Queen died, like a bank holiday, well up until the 1850s. And this book, published in 1726, was part of the celebrations that year. When I first bought this book, which, to be honest with you, I've never read because it's not my reading matter, it's the historical interest of it I liked. But when I first bought it, it only had its pages. There was no front or backboard, and it wasn't bound as you see it now. It was literally just pages. But I managed to sew the pages back together and bind them, and then create a front and backboard, which I bound in royal blue velvet, being as it was something royal, and I had this to hand, this colour. Well, this could get this fairly easily, this velvet. But yeah, that's a modern replacement of marble paper. All the fanciest books in those days had marble paper in them, and this is original, this one. But the book itself, which would not interest pretty much anyone now, it might, some people, it might, tell a lie, could be maligning people there. Certain sermons or homilies appointed to be read in churches in the time of Queen Elizabeth of most famous memory. London. Printed for A. Bettersworth in Paternoster Row, S. Burt in Ave Maria Lane, C. Rivington and T. Astley in St. Paul's Churchyard, MDCC XXVI, which translates to 1726. But what I love about this book is the detail of the printing. I mean, as you can see, it's a little work of art in its own right, and a piece of history. And the fact that they were still publishing these things 123 years after she died, it goes to speak of the era and the interest that she and that era had, really. This is my favourite page, because what you see here is Tower of London, Whitehall Palace, the Queen in her royal barge on the Thames, Old St Paul's Cathedral and Old London. And you see the sun in splendour shining down on London. But this is my favourite page for that image. But the preface, as it was published in the year 1562, considering how necessary it is that the word of God, which is the only food for the soul and the most excellent light, that we must walk in this our most dangerous pilgrimage. I won't go on because, as I say, it's not really my cup of tea, and the F's and S's look very, very similar in this book, very similar indeed. But as I say about the detail, I mean, look, for each big title page, the first letter, or the title letter, is like this. It's in its own background. I mean, the C there for considering, and there again you have, that could be St Paul's, Westminster Abbey, anything. Oh, that's what I meant to say. There's Westminster Abbey there. That's meant to be Westminster Abbey. But yeah. Another lovely opening title. Letter, look. Capitals they're called. Not just the letters, but the things themselves. And it's a long book, and it goes on to all different types of things. I mean, look, against adultery there, it might come in handy for a good few nowadays. But we'll get to the end, because there's a very interesting part in here that I want to focus on. See the old paper, very, very old paper. That's the finished, but Thanksgiving for the suppression of the late rebellion. Now this, bearing in mind, was published in the time of Queen Elizabeth II, and the suppression of the late rebellion, they had a lot of rebellions in their time there, the Babington Plot and the Essex Rebellion, all sorts. So this was a prayer of thanksgiving that would have been published in Elizabeth's time. In this book it doesn't tell us what exactly the rebellion it was, but that's why it was published for, Thanksgiving against the rebellion. And she saw a good few of those in her time, didn't she, bless her? So that is my little piece of history that I'm very proud to own. I love owning this because, as I say, the imagery in it, it's a piece of real history. So, I hope you've all found this interesting. Well, that concludes the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth I. What I thought was going to be a fairly short or shortish documentary starting out turned out to be rather a long one. And at times it's felt as if I was researching for 15 or 16 different documentaries all at once. Such a complex, interesting woman, and many facets to her character and the age that she lived in. It's been an interesting one to research, this one, and I hope you've all found it interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and if you've watched all the way through, thanks for sticking in there.